Hello, class. This is Daniel Boley once again from the Career and Internship Center. I want to thank you for coming to class today to hear this presentation. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a different topic from last time. I'm going to focus today a little bit on another step in the job search process. We're going to talk today a little bit about how to go about acing an interview so that you can set yourself up for the best possible outcomes in your job search. Now, before we get started, just to reiterate a couple elements of our services, I won't go over them in too much detail because we covered them in the last presentation, but our office is still, as I mentioned before, despite the current global situation, our office is still offering all of our services in a virtual capacity outside of the career closet, meaning we can still do coaching appointments virtually through Zoom or via phone. We are still providing support in terms of interview prep, resume and cover letter reviews, some events and programs that we're holding, and other elements of tools for professional development for you. We actually just recently held a professional development event for student employees. So we are holding things like that, as well as, again, those virtual employer happy hours where employers are coming to talk to us about their companies and potentially about opportunities that you could look into for yourself for the summer and for the near future. Now, the career cycle I brought up last time, and when we talked about resumes and cover letters, I mentioned that we were in the communicate your brand step of the career cycle. Now we're at a little bit of a later stage in it, right? So you've put your resume and cover letter out there, you've applied for the job, you've gotten an interview opportunity. Now we're in the last stage, which we refer to as create your opportunities. This is the space where now that you've been given the chance to come into a meeting, talk with the employer, and potentially get yourself an offer, you want to make sure that we are taking the opportunities that are given and maximizing them, setting ourselves up for success as best as we possibly can so that we can hopefully get the best possible outcome from that interview being an offer. So once again, these are the three career specialists that we have here at UB: Matthew Johnson for CPA, Sarah Holiday for MSB, and myself for CAS. So our contact information is available here. In the event that you could use any of our assistance on this, I definitely encourage you to reach out to us for some additional support. Today, we're going to talk about four main things. One being the types of interviews that are out there, another being interview questions, some that are common, ways to handle questions, and talking about questions yourself that you might ask, interview research, and then how to follow up on an interview. Now, looking at an interview, it's very easy to just say, I'm going to jump right on into an interview in the sense of, I'm going to go into it based off of what I know in the job description, not worry about anything else, not do a lot of looking into the organization that you would be working for. But generally speaking, I advise against that because I find that going into an interview without a real in-depth understanding of the company means you're likely going to get caught off guard by questions that might not have been directly connecting to something in the job description. I really view the interview process as a research-based situation. So it's really important that you think about, the company that you'll be applying for as a whole, beyond just what your job description is. To do this, I encourage you to do research on this company. Look into where they've been in the news lately. Look at their company website and see what kind of other positions they have. See what work they do. Look into things like their mission statement. What values do they have? How do they align with your own? It's going to be important for you, not only in terms of feeling prepared for the interview process and being able to answer questions effectively, but also in the aftermath, in figuring out for yourself, do I have enough information to make an informed decision about whether or not this is the optimal opportunity for me and whether or not I want to take it? Because sometimes doing this research will also help you to find red flags with a company, things that might be cause for concern, or things that you might have questions about and need to ask those questions about during the interview. The interview team, if you have an idea of who is going to be interviewing you, it can be helpful to look into their profiles on the company website if they have them, just to get a better sense of who they are and what things might be helpful to talk about or to mention, mainly in terms of commonalities or just in terms of getting a sense of what their backgrounds are in. LinkedIn is also helpful for this, but be cautious with this. You want to make sure it doesn't come off like you're, being a little overbearing of, oh, I looked at, when I looked at your LinkedIn profile, I saw that 10 years ago you were doing this job and blah, 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 blah. Sometimes that can put people off a little bit. So really use it kind of as a tool just to inform your own decision-making and thinking about what kind of experiences and questions you might want to bring up during the interview. Finally, interview style. This is dependent on if they give you this information in advance. So, some companies will even give you an idea of what questions they're going to ask you, and it can be helpful with those to prepare them in advance, or at least prepare an idea of what you want to say in advance. You don't want to sound like you're robotically answering something off of a script, but thinking about how long is the interview going to be, what type of interview it's going to be, the questions that might be available. You can also do Google searches or use Glassdoor as a tool to give you an idea of interview types and questions that are commonly asked. The truth is that interviewing is a process, and it begins as soon as you make your first connection with the company. Whether that be with the recruiter at a networking event, whether that be sending out the application, what have you. The important thing is that everything you do from that point onward has the potential to impact how you are viewed by the organization that you are applying to work for. Interviewing is not just answering questions, which kind of falls in line with what I was just saying, but there are three key components that I think you want to really focus on making sure you feel like you're getting accomplished or getting an understanding of by the end of an interview. So one being competency. You want the company to know that you are competent, capable, and qualified for the position. Two is chemistry. Developing a rapport with the people that you're interviewing with. You want them to get a sense of who you are authentically as a person, why you're excited about the opportunity, and also to try to make them feel like, yeah, I could see myself working with this person, or I would be excited about the chance to work with this person. And finally, compensation, although that part can come a little bit more in the aftermath of the process, I do generally say I advise against trying to ask salary negotiation related questions in the interview process, and instead to wait until after an offer has been received, because otherwise it can be a little bit off-putting to employers, and that can leave them feeling like you're in it more for just the money or benefits rather than for the actual job itself. Um, Again, though, at the same time, it is important to think about these things from the standpoint of your own personal circumstances. What are your non-negotiables going into the job search, and what things do you have to know, again, to make that informed career decision in the event that there's information that you need to know that maybe isn't on the job description or job posting. The bottom line is you have to go in there prepared to tell them what value you will bring to them as an organization. How am I going to make this organization better by being a part of it? And how can I fulfill the responsibilities associated with this job if I were to be hired? The interview is also not just about them learning about you, but also you learning about them. Again, it goes back to that idea of how can I make an informed decision about my career based on what we're talking about in the interview today? Figuring out what questions you need answered that maybe are not listed there on the job posting, because I'm willing to guarantee there are some questions you may still have that could be helpful to get answered there. Getting an idea of what they're looking for. Are there any red flags that are coming up as you're asking questions or going through the interview process? What kind of culture is there in this organization? Things like that need to be at the forefront of your mind in order to make sure that you are getting the most out of the interview process. Now, here you'll see a diagram that has a lot of different statistics, and we won't be going over all of them, although I do encourage you to take some time to look at them on your own. But the key one is up in the top left, this idea that 1/3 of employers decide within 90 seconds whether they have an interest in hiring you. And this is largely based on the fact that first impressions are critical in the interview process. This idea that you want to make sure that they are having a positive impression of you first, because humans are inherently very impressionable. And sometimes when people get a certain impression of somebody, it can be harder to change that. So in those first 90 seconds, if you end up leaving a great impression, then it can give you a little bit more leeway in the event that you're not able to answer everything perfectly, because the employer may likely already have a good view of you. Um, and so be more understanding of things like that. On the flip side, if you have a difficult first impression, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to get the job or get the interview. You can definitely salvage an interview that starts off poorly. However, I would argue that it becomes more of an uphill battle. And so we want to just try to avoid things that could put you at a disadvantage at the start. So a couple things here that I will point out that I think are really important to think about. Timing is key. There's never a reason you should be late to an interview. There really are no excuses that are generally accepted for that. If you think there's even the slightest chance that it could happen, make something happen. Even if you have to arrive early and sit in your car in the parking lot for a while, you got to do what you can to make sure you're not late. On the flip side of that, though, you also don't want to just be in their office an hour ahead of your interview, because it causes the employer to have to entertain you basically for that time frame. And that can just be a little bit awkward or off-putting. So the general rule of thumb is to try to arrive 10 to 15 minutes in advance of an interview. Again, in those first impressions vein of things, When they come up and greet you, not smiling, offering a weak handshake, or not making good eye contact are just general things that I think show a lack of, or seem to convey a lack of interest or enthusiasm or energy about the interview process or this opportunity. So those don't tend to go over well either. They don't show confidence. They don't show, again, that enthusiasm, that energy, or that interest in what is going on right now. Wearing clothes that do not fit the company image, or that do not align with the level of professionalism you would expect based on your industry. So if I was going into an interview working for a corporate, a corporation in big business, I would not be walking in there in anything probably less than like a suit, just for the sake of knowing that that's probably more in line with professional standards there. You can also look into this in advance of the interview by looking up, you know, pictures or things related to your industry of what people wear. And it can also be helpful to look at the company website, see what employees are wearing in pictures of the company and the people there doing their work. Using your phone. This is a big one. A third of millennials think it's fine to text during an interview, and it is not. The other thing that I sometimes get asked is about using your phone to take notes in an interview, which is an interesting point. But what I generally say is, instead of that, I encourage you to take notes with pen and paper instead. And the reason is, even if you are genuinely using a phone or an iPad to take notes in an interview, there is a negative stigma that tends to be attached to you being on technology during an interview, except if you were like pulling up your portfolio on a laptop or doing something with audiovisual materials that they ask you to do for the interview process. Now, this could be an exception if there is some form of an accommodation that's needed for you in order to take notes in this way, that, that could be a little bit different and is generally going to be probably more accepted, especially if you clarify it to the employer in advance. I always say silence your phone, turn it off in advance of the interview, unless you absolutely have a life or death emergency that's coming up or that's going on, in which case you need to keep your phone on. And if that is the case, I always say that you want to let the employer know as far in advance as possible so that they, recognize why that is the case, because generally speaking, it can be very distracting. Other things to think about: not being able to articulate your achievements that are in your resume. If you write things on your resume and you're not even able to recall what they were or to think on them and reflect on them effectively in an interview, it shows that you maybe didn't really look into it since you sent out that first application. It can make you look a little bit less prepared and professional. Same idea is fumbling for answers. A couple other things: not knowing anything about that company. Again, almost half of employers will hold it against you if you haven't done research and failed to show knowledge of the company in the interview. That's why I think it's helpful to have questions prepared about the company themselves, because it shows your preparation. Talking too much about why you lost or left the previous job. Generally, if that's the case, if they ask you a question about that, I say to keep it brief so that you're not spending too much time on a negative topic. And then also getting either too comfortable or seeming too physically uncomfortable during the interview, just for the sake of, it can kind of create some awkwardness, and being overly casual can give the impression of unprofessionalism. Some final things: focusing more on what you want from the company and not what you can do for them. Again, you want to convey the value you're bringing to the company, and then ask some questions potentially about things you would need to know in order to be an effective employee there. But you want to make it clear that you're excited about the opportunity, not about the things that the job's going to give you necessarily. Not following up on the opportunity is a big one that generally is not always done very effectively. So we're going to talk a little bit more later about how to follow up effectively, but making sure that you are following up after an interview is important. The balancing act of that is you don't want to follow up overtly aggressively to the point that you are potentially being overbearing with the employer. So I say you want to follow up one time after the interview's over, and then not again unless the time frame in which they said they would contact you has passed and you haven't heard from them. Final thing: not asking questions. It's a big one. It just makes it seem that you haven't done any research, you haven't thought critically about the opportunity, because if you have, you probably will have at least a couple of questions that they can answer for you in the interview. And to me, that kind of reflects an extra level of intentionality in your prep for the interview process. So the 4 goals of interviewing: the first one is to connect, right? Interact with the interviewer in order to develop a rapport, enhance your chemistry with them, get them feeling like they could see themselves working with you. The second goal is clarifying the primary things that the job requires of you, or the things that you would need to do or that would happen as a result of you holding this position. 3 is collaborate. This is just, breaking down how what you bring to the table would allow you to excel in the job, how you would do the job, and why you would be successful in that role. And then 4, closing out respectfully, expressing appreciation for the opportunity, following up, and reiterating your interest and excitement. So some of the most common questions that I run into in terms of talking about interviews are questions that begin with the idea of, tell me about a time when this happened or when you had to demonstrate this skill. And these questions can be a little bit unnerving for students because the questions require you to really think back on a situation that has a lot of depth to it that you can talk about. And one tool that I think would be helpful in preparing for interviews to do this is the STAR technique, which is basically you identify the situation that happened to you that you like. If you're thinking about a specific question, you think about a situation that you dealt with, and you would express, by the way, you would address this to the employer in the form of the answer to the interview. First, you explain the situation. What was going on? What was the issue that was at hand? Then the task. What were you specifically asked to do in order to address the situation or responsible for doing? Next, you talk about the action you did to end up taking in order to address the situation. And finally, the response or the result. What came of it, or what did you learn? Not all situations that you'll talk about in an interview necessarily ended positively in terms of like everything got fixed and addressed and everybody was happy, but you can address what you learned about yourself, about your skill set, about your overall experience through the overall situation that you talk about. So in advance of the interview, it can be helpful to look up common questions that start with, tell me about a time when this happened, situational questions, and really practicing to yourself thinking, okay, now if I got asked this question, what kind of situation have I experienced that might be good things for me to talk about in an interview that would make sense here? And then from there, you can break down for yourself how you would go about each of these different steps. And then in advance of the interview, you'll at least have some things floating around in your mind that'll be easier for you to pull out than having to try to think of them on the spot, having given it no thought in advance of the interview. So types of interviews, there are more than just now the standard in-person one-on-one interviews, which, there have been a diversification of interview types over time. And right now we're definitely seeing some very unique situations because of the current global climate. So one of the big things we're noticing is a vast increase in the amount of video and phone interviews that are going on, in large part because people are simply not meeting in person. And while these these interview types can be successful and can be done well, they do cause you to think about some different things that you might not be thinking about for a one-on-one in-person interview. So for example, I personally am a person that I think expresses a lot of my emotion through my face and my body language, my hand gestures, things along those lines. That's how I get across to an employer that I'm energized, I'm excited about an opportunity, and I, am really looking forward to the opportunity to work for them. But if I'm doing a phone interview, I don't have any of the ability to show my body language or to show my face. I lose those opportunities. And so I have to focus my energy and my attention on different ways to convey that enthusiasm. And normally that comes in the form of me making sure my voice is keeping, a very good use of inflection, making sure that I sound excited about the opportunity, even if I can't physically show it. With video interviews, a thing that you have to consider is what's in my background. Is there a lot of noise going on in my background? Do I have things behind me in my video that are distracting or inappropriate? Am I in a place where there's a good internet connection? Because if it's not and it's cutting out, that can also not look like great preparation. Things along those lines. So really thinking intentionally about what an interview is going to look like on your end and in the view of the interviewer, and how you can prepare yourself in advance for those things is going to set you up for success. Interview attire and preparation, in terms of just as a general rule for interviews, I say it's very helpful to prepare your outfit in advance the night before, make sure it's washed, dried, ironed, what have you, so that you don't have to worry about anything like that the day of. It can also help you to find out if there's something you have that is, not prepared the way you thought it was going to be for the day of, so that you can take care of it and not be panicking the day of the interview. Next, practice good hygiene in advance, showering, deodorant, what have you, just so that you make sure that there's nothing that could be potentially off-putting or make you seem less prepared than you maybe are for the interview. In addition, when in doubt of the type of attire to wear, I suggest leaning more towards the formal side of things. Now, this is going to be a little bit dependent on industry, but as I talked about before, especially if you know the kind of attire that's standard in your industry, you want to lean in that direction or potentially being more formal just for the sake of never looking like you're unprofessional for that reason. I do suggest avoiding anything in terms of attire or accessories that could be seen as overly flashy or distracting or revealing. In addition, like very vibrant or just vibrant to the point of distracting patterns can also be a little bit much. This can depend a little bit on your industry. Some industries are a little bit more flexible in this area, but I generally say to lean on the side of more straight-laced, straightforward, professional attire. Hair or facial hair or both being neat and clean in advance of the interview. This kind of goes back to that hygiene piece, the idea of just making sure that you are overall looking good, feeling good, and ready to show them why you are really good, and the best candidate possible for the interview and for the opportunity. So talking about the 4 stages of interviewing, this is really just giving you a breakdown of what an interview tends to look like, in terms of the things you need to think about at each stage in the timeline of the interview. These are the 4 stages. I'm going to go over each of them really quickly in a little bit of detail, just so that you have more information on how they're each going to play a part in you getting more information during the interview and setting yourself apart from other candidates during the interview. So first is the introduction. This is very straightforward. This is where the employer comes out, they call your name, they're introducing themselves to you. Some things to keep in mind: you want to make sure you have a good firm handshake for the interview. You don't want to be like breaking their hand, but you also don't want to have like your hand to be limp and not really be, come across as confident. You want to be prepared to engage in some small talk, because it generally will happen while you're walking over to the interview location, or if you're on a video call at the very beginning of the interview, what have you. Be prepared for that. Come across comfortable and confident in the way that you're responding to things, and start building that rapport with the interviewer. So again, not trying to seem overly casual, but making it clear that you want to develop a positive relationship with them. You're confident, you're professional, but you're also able to engage with them in a social capacity that's also professional. Some things to keep in mind: skip the cliches. Employers have heard them all before. Generally speaking, they can make you sound a little bit less authentic, I think, if you're getting a little overly cliche in the way you're answering things or doing things. I think it can be helpful to try to find a common interest early on in the process. If there's anything industry specific, technology related, if you notice something, if you notice that they happen to have graduated from the same university that you did because you see the diploma on their wall or something to that effect, that might be something you might notice. Of course, that's just a very random example, but it could still come into play. Commenting on something company related can be helpful. If you've seen in the news recently that got some new initiatives or they've won an award, that can be helpful. And thinking about asking some career related questions, if you have the time to ask, how long have they been working there, or how things have been for them around the office, or things like that. So the next stage is the review of the background. This is the review of your background, where they're going to be asking you questions about yourself, why you're a good candidate, tell me about a time situations where you're going to want to prepare answers to some of the commonly asked questions, have star stories ready to be delivered, and trying to answer questions as much as possible in around 60 seconds or less. Generally, beyond that, people tend to ramble. Next, some openers to questions might be, when you're going into your own questions, this idea of how did you build your career, or what do you think some of the biggest challenges within your position are? These can be helpful just to give you an idea of how the employees are currently experiencing the company. Next is the employer information. This is, this is again going off of the end of what we talked about in stage 2, this idea of your questions, getting information that you need in order to make an informed decision on whether or not you want to work for this company, and getting the answers to things that maybe are not in the job posting. So seeking clarity there and having your questions prepared. I always say a minimum of 3 questions should be brought to every single interview that you have. You might even think of some during the interview. And if you're taking notes, you can write them down for yourself. But some common ones you could consider would be ones that are listed here. So what are your expectations within the first however many days of my hiring? Would there be professional development opportunities? Do you have an estimated time frame for filling this position? And I think that's a key one, because people definitely get a little nervous if they don't hear back from the company. But asking this kind of a question can give you a time frame, because if they say they're trying to hire somebody within the next week and you don't hear back from them by the end of next week, you know to try to follow up with them the week after to confirm this and see what's going on. Finally, the conclusion. This is where you're thanking the interviewer for their time, asking them for their business card, finding out what next steps might be necessary if they need more information, if they're going to contact you at a certain time or do a follow-up. And you want to follow up with them in the form of a thank you letter. Now, this can be either physical or in email format, usually depending on the time frame. If I know that there's a very quick turnaround for the employer on hiring, they're trying to hire by next week, I would probably send an email version of a thank you letter to them. But if I know that there's a lot of time left in the interview process and I feel like I could send out a letter to them and they would receive it by then I might send a physical letter. And these would be ones where you would try to thank them for the opportunity, again, express that excitement, and try to refer back to anything that really stood out to you during the interview process. If there was a specific comment that they made or something that you really enjoyed about the opportunity, you can clarify that, and that shows that you were paying close attention to things during the interview. Finally, assessing yourself after the interview's over. When you get back in the car, a lot of times people will take notes right away for themselves of like big things they want to make sure to remember to include in a thank you letter, or information they really wanted to take note of for themselves that they felt like was good, or maybe things that concerned them. But also reflecting to yourself at that point in time on how you're feeling about it. Do you feel like you did well in that interview or not? And why? And then what did you learn from the experience? Again, what information did you get out of it that will help you to make your own decisions? Because at the end of the day, that's really what's going to be, and that's going to be a really critical part of your overall decision making. So next, we're going to talk about some tools for answering questions. This is going to be, what are some common questions you might see and how could you address them? So here you have a list of 10 typical interview questions. These questions are pretty general based, so they don't go industry specific, although there are certainly going to be some industry specific questions you'll see in an interview. These are not going to all be in every interview, but there are some common ones here. What would you say is your greatest career accomplishment? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Tell me about a time when you experienced this or that, things along those lines. But there is one question you'll always be able to prepare for, because companies always ask it. And that is number one, tell me about yourself. Companies pretty much always ask this question because they want to start off by getting a sense of who you are and what kind of a person you want to present yourself as. So I always say that this is important because it's the one question that they'll ask you, so it is a question that you can prepare in depth for in advance of the interview. Again, this shouldn't sound like you're reading off of a script or anything along those lines, but it can help you to feel like, at the very least, going into the interview, I know that when they ask me about that question, I'm going to want to talk a little bit about, my experiences or my history, my values, what I am passionate about, why I'm passionate about this field or this opportunity, and what I think that I bring to the table that is important for them to know. Generally with these questions, I do advise against putting overly personal information out there, but that's a little bit of a balancing act that can be dependent a little bit on the rapport of the interview and the type of role that you are applying to work in. But just as a general rule, avoiding things that are overly personal to the point that it might be a little bit overwhelming or off-putting to the interview, as part of answering the first question in an interview. And another part of this is that you want to make sure to answer this question well, because I generally find that when students feel that they've answered the first question well, they tend to feel a lot of confidence and momentum going into the rest of the interview questions. And even though they don't necessarily know exactly what questions will be asked of them for the rest of the interview, they still feel like they got the first one under their belt successfully. And so now they feel like they have a better chance of successfully answering the rest of the questions. The opposite can also be true. If a student feels like they struggle in answering a question that's just tell me about yourself, they sometimes tend to feel worse about the rest of their responses to questions. This is a question that partly I also encourage you to prepare for in depth, because a lot of times people think that they can just wing it when it comes to talking about themselves. But what I generally find is people start to trip over their words, don't know exactly what they want to talk about, and then end up sounding very unconfident and unsure, using a lot of vocal fillers such as like, etc. And those tend to make the person look less prepared, confident, and professional. So these are 5 common questions you could choose to ask an employer yourself. I definitely encourage you to think of questions on your own as well, but these are some that I found to be effective and helpful. So what are your goals or expectations within the first year? This gives you an idea of what they're hoping for from the person that they hire. It can give you an idea of what you can expect your workload and your experience to look like if you were to work there early on, especially as you're learning the ropes. Can you tell me more about day-to-day responsibilities of the position? Again, this goes back to getting a sense of what your experience would be like if you were hired. What is my life going to be like every day now at work from now on? And is that the kind of experience and the way that I would want to, live my life on a given day-to-day basis? And if it's not, then that might be something that is a point of potential concern for you when you're thinking about whether or not to take a job. Next, what do you believe are the most important qualities for someone to excel in this role? Again, this just gives an idea of the skills that they feel are really helpful to somebody being successful in this position. And then from there, you can cross-check them with your own skills to see if you feel like your skill set matches up well. Questions about the culture of the organization, I think these can be framed, professionally, such as this, without sounding kind of attacking or accusatory. And they can be really important because you want to get a sense of how employees feel about working for this company, about the realistic strengths and potential challenges or weaknesses that the company might be facing now and moving forward, because that way you'll know, again, what you're getting yourself into. I also think it can be helpful from a different stance to potentially ask questions such as, what do you see as the biggest challenge that this company is going to face in the next X number of years? Because it doesn't say that, it's not framing it as this is something you're facing right now, like a problem that this company has, but it's more of, what do you think needs to be in the forefront of my mind as potential challenges that we could face if I were to take this job? Finally, what are the next steps of the interview process? This is a really good question to ask, just again to prepare yourself so that you feel confident in your understanding of what the next steps are. And so you're not tempted to panic if you don't hear back right away and feel like you need to continually follow up with the organization. So again, when I talked about follow-ups before, this is what I was referring to, this idea of sending a thank you within 24 to 48 hours, either handwritten or by email. Everyone who interviews you should receive a thank you note. That means if you interview with 5 or 6 people in that interview, every single one of them should be receiving a thank you note or email, just for the sake of, again, showing that you paid attention to each of them, you value all of them taking the time out of their day to interview you, and for sharing their insights with you on this opportunity. The general formula, you're going to want to have a personal touch to it. Again, that idea of, these are the pieces that I pulled from the interview that I found particularly insightful or valuable. The thanks with some context, the plug for the fact that, again, you are really excited about this opportunity and look forward to, communicating with them more in the future, and sending off. So this is an example of one. You can see, looking at the middle section of it, they really appreciated the perspective on where Vault is going and how this position fits into the framework. Their conversation about expanding the blog specifically. So, and then how it frames that they're interested in gaining writing experience, and they're looking forward to speaking further about the position. Hope to hear from them soon. Have a nice weekend. It's specific to this person because this person had that conversation with them, and it again reiterates the fact that they thank them for that opportunity, and they're for giving their perspective. So that is kind of a wrap up for this presentation today on effective interviewing skills, tips, and strategies. One thing that I will say to wrap up is that our office does also provide an interview guide that is available on the UBalt website. If you go to ubalt.edu and you type in "prepare for an interview" to the search bar, it should be the first thing that shows up. And there is a link within that page that goes to our office interview guide. I will also be sending it to Dr. DeBell along with this presentation so that you have it available for your own use, as it has some additional sample questions that could be asked, some additional information on professional attire and things to do or not do, types of interviews, as well as questions that employers, or types of questions that employers are not permitted to ask you about. So I encourage you to take a look at all of that. And again, to reiterate from some of our previous talks in this class, the fact that our office is here to support you. We do provide support in the form of mock interviews and interview preparation, and that one of our newest resources is a virtual mock interview module where you can actually go into your UBWorks account and do a virtual mock interview, which will be one where you'll have a recorded version of me asking you questions, and will then give you some time to process the question and then to record yourself responding to it. From there, you can send in your recorded interview responses for feedback, and I would go into it, watch your responses to each of them, and provide you with feedback on the way that you responded, both verbally and non-verbally. This can be helpful as, again, a practice tool because you can do it for free online on your own time, and I strongly encourage you to take advantage of it. So thank you once again for your time. I truly appreciate it. I am so grateful to Dr. DeBell for being so flexible in bringing us in for this classroom presentation, in a pre-recorded format. It has been a fantastic time getting this information together. I hope that it has been helpful to you, and I encourage you to reach out to myself or to your specific career specialist with any particular questions that you might have. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your night. Bye.